Okay, everybody, our closing luncheon presentation is going to get started here. So this is the closing luncheon presentation of the Wisconsin Community Media Conference in Madison. We're really excited about this presentation today. The theme is Building the Future of Media, Expanding Broadband Infrastructure, and Filling the Gap in Local News Coverage. We have three speakers today. We're starting with Jaron McCullen. He is the Strategic Initiative Coordinator for the Wisconsin Broadband Office in the Division of Digital Access, Consumer and Environmental Affairs of the Public Service Commission of Wisconsin. In his role, Jaron pursues strategic initiatives, projects, and partnerships to advance broadband expansion, support technical assistance to communities, promote digital equity and inclusion, and more. Jaron will be talking about where the state of Wisconsin has identified broadband needs, how the PSC is managing the application process, which is completed for infrastructure grants, and what the PSC's goals are for the program. Please welcome Jaron McCollum.
Thank you, Mary. I appreciate that introduction. Hello and good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. As Mary mentioned, my name is Jaron McCullum, and I am the Strategic Initiatives Coordinator in the Wisconsin Broadband Office at the Public Service Commission of Wisconsin, which is a state agency here in Madison. I've been with the PSC for a number of years now, 6, I think going on 7 years, various roles focusing on things like mapping and data and policy and a pretty broad range of issues. I kind of wear a lot of hats in the broadband office, but I've been with the office since 2015. I should say thank you. I appreciate the invitation to speak today. Thank you to the Wisconsin Community Media and Mary. I appreciate that. So I'm going to talk a bit about broadband today because we really are entering into and will be entering into a very momentous time in the world of broadband access. There is heightened awareness and heightened and increased funding that's coming our way, and significant progress has really been made to connect more individuals across the state, but we know that more individuals lack the access that they need, so it's an important issue. Today I plan to talk a little bit about what broadband is and why broadband is important. I may be preaching to the choir there, but I like to kind of let that set that framework, and then I will talk a bit about the challenges and problems that we face, and I'll talk a bit about the broadband office and what we do and how we are hoping to solve those problems and challenges. And I will say that there's a lot of moving parts in the world of broadband right now. I'm going to take a pretty high-level overview, but I'd be happy to take questions at the end if there are any. So let's talk a bit about what broadband is. So broadband is internet access that is always on and faster than traditional dial-up service. Currently, the FCC, or the Federal Communications Commission, sets that benchmark at 25 megabits per second download and 3 megabits per second upload. Speed definitions have changed over the years. This current one at 25.3 has been in existence since 2015, I believe. So that the benchmarks have changed historically over the years, but one thing that we know, kind of irregardless of those benchmarks, is that the need for more speed, both upload and download, is increasing over time, and it's probably not stopping. So there is a lot of federal funding coming our way as well, and a lot of that federal funding sets the benchmark, kind of that minimum benchmark at 100 megabits per second download and 20 megabits per second upload. So that 25.3 benchmark is still important at the FCC, but things are moving past that. Another kind of common question that we get oftentimes is, what technologies can be used to deploy broadband, and what does broadband mean, and is it the same as high-speed internet access? And there are those benchmarks, but a lot of times broadband and high-speed internet access are used interchangeably. Here are some common technologies that are used to deploy broadband, things like fiber, cable, DSL or copper, fixed wireless, mobile, and satellite services. I would note there's a lot of emerging technologies as well, things like low Earth orbit satellites. You may have heard of Starlink. Those are emerging technologies that are kind of coming onto the scene now. But the point of this slide is that there's a number of different technologies that can be used to deploy broadband. So why is broadband important? Again, I feel like sometimes I might be preaching to the choir here, but it's necessary and really critical for access to essential services and participation in the modern economy and society. So it's just really critical, and I like to think, I'm not going to read all these up there on the slide, but things like teleworking, doing telehealth, telelearning, agriculture, home real estate values, there's just a number of endless and infinite applications for broadband. And I really think that broadband can be a catalyst for more vibrant and more prosperous communities. And again, it bears repeating that broadband truly is an essential service, and it's no longer a luxury. So what's the challenge, and what's the problem? We know that there are a number of unconnected households, residents, and businesses across the state. There was a 2021 FCC, again, the Federal Communications Commission report that estimated that just shy of 7% of Wisconsin residents lacked access to fixed 25 down and 3 up service. We know that that number is probably higher in reality, just due to the way that the FCC reports their data. So we know that we can assume that the problem is actually larger than that just shy of 7% that I mentioned. The point being is that we know that there are unserved residents across the state. We have, I should say, the state has been putting dollars towards this issue, and we have been making progress, but we know that there is more to be done, and we know that there's unserved locations and residents and areas across the state. And I should say before I wrap up this slide, it's really more than just access as well. A lot of times people focus on the infrastructure, going past your front yard or going past the business. It's more than that. It's about affordability. It's about adoption. I like to think of it as a three-legged stool. It's access, it's affordability, and it's adoption, really supporting broadband access as a whole. So it's really important to think about more than just access and think about the affordability and the adoption components. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. So this is where we really get into the broadband office. So the broadband office, again, is housed at the Public Service Commission of Wisconsin. And our vision is that all Wisconsinites have the information technology capacity needed to fully participate in society. And then our mission goes on to say, making high-performance broadband more accessible, ubiquitous, and affordable in Wisconsin. So at our core, that's what we're working towards. Now let's talk a bit about, I'll probably spend a fair amount of time on this slide, but how are we reaching those goals? How are we making progress in connecting residents and individuals? So the first one being leadership and vision. We see ourselves and we serve as kind of the leaders and coordinators of broadband and digital equity programs and goals and strategies across the state. An example of that would be there is a Governor's Task Force on Broadband Access that launched in 2020, and we staff and administer that task force. That task force is a member of, consists of appointed members. They have kind of a broad range of expertise, but broadly that task force is tasked with advising the governor and legislature on broadband actions and policies. So we help to administer and keep that task force running. Next being data and mapping. Not sure how familiar the group is with broadband as a whole, but data and mapping is really core to what we do as an office and infrastructure expansion across the state as a whole. We maintain a number of maps and data sources, and we are always striving for more accurate maps, data, so we as the PSC and the state, and also stakeholders across the state and nation can be making more informed decisions as to where broadband is and where it isn't. As it currently stands, it's difficult to know at a particular address right now, does that address have service or not? It may be a little bit more apparent in urban or more populated areas, but in rural areas, the data that's behind that, it's challenging still yet to determine where exactly broadband is, but we're making strides and we're getting there. We also map and display a number of the grant applications that come in and the awards that we make. And then finally, we're always trying to align with the FCC at the federal level. They're doing a lot of work improving their maps as well. The next one being strategic investment in infrastructure. So we are directing and coordinating federal funds, some federal funds, state funds to areas of highest need. That could be for a number of different reasons, but oftentimes these grant dollars help to assist in extending infrastructure to areas that maybe have lower population density or difficult terrain. And it gives that kind of extra assistance for, say, an internet service provider to extend their infrastructure into that area where they otherwise might not have done that because the business case wasn't there. I'll talk more about funding later on. I'll talk about our current grant round and then some of the infrastructure dollars that are coming our way. The next one being digital equity. I spoke a bit about this earlier, but we really know that it's more than just access. It's affordability, it's adoption, it's device access, it's digital literacy. It's a number of different things and beyond just that investment in infrastructure. Our office has been promoting the Affordable Connectivity Program. It's a relatively new program coming from the federal dollars. It's a program that eligible households can receive $30 off on their monthly internet bills and up to $75 on tribal land. So it's a very important program to tackling that issue of affordability. So we're always trying to promote that and get eligible households to sign up for that and take advantage of that. I'm going to talk a bit more about digital equity funding later on within the infrastructure dollars, but to wrap up, let's talk a bit about partnership and capacity building. So we know that we have a number of engaged stakeholders across the state, and we can't do this alone, and we have common goals, and we need to work with them. We have a number of issues that we're looking at, things like technical assistance and education and facilitation at the local level is something in particular that we were focused on. For example, we had a Broadband Connectors pilot program in 2020 where a number of communities across the state applied to receive technical assistance from our office and in partnership with the Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation. And we were able to select 6 communities and provide them with technical assistance and help them get on their broadband journey, so to speak. So now I want to talk about the Broadband Expansion Grant Program. I oftentimes find that people are most interested in the funding, so I'm going to spend probably the remainder of the time talking about funding. So the purpose of the grant program is really to encourage the deployment of advanced telecommunication capability in underserved areas of the state. Just to give you some context, since 2019, Wisconsin has invested nearly $200 million and connecting about 300,000 more residents and businesses as a result, or will be in the future. Some of those projects are still ongoing. And we've leveraged both state and federal funds in the past. And our current grant round leverages state dollars, but we have previously leveraged dollars from CARES and ARPA as well. So I want to talk about our current grant round. So we currently are reviewing applications. We received grant applications. They were due on March 17th, so a little over a month and a half ago. We received impressive demand. We had 194 applications come in, almost $500 million in requests. As you can see, we have $100 million to award. So pretty significant demand for this program. That's consistent with previous grant rounds. We've had a number of grant cycles over the years. So that's consistent. But we do expect to make awards in early summer of 2022 this year. And I will mention that funding for this grant round did come from the 2021-2023 state biennial budget. It's important to note the source of the funds when you're talking about broadband funding, because oftentimes the source of the funds dictates how the applications are reviewed for eligibility and how they're scored. So it is important to note that this current grant round is leveraging state dollars. And eligible applications to apply for this grant round were for-profit and not-for-profit organizations, telecommunications utilities, and also public entities that formed a public-private partnership. So next, let's talk. I should say, there is a map of the applicants that we received. It's probably a little bit challenging to decipher, but that's the 194 applications that we received across the state. So I'll just give a moment to take a peek at that. It's also available online. So I want to talk, you probably have seen in the news, or maybe I live in a broadband corner of the news, but you may have seen in the news there's a lot of broadband funding coming from the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. There's a lot of funding coming to the world of broadband. I refer to it as IJA. It doesn't roll off the tongue quite as well as ARPA, but that's the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. It's also kind of known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law or Bill. And like I said, this is one of the next major waves of funding coming to the world of broadband. At a very high level, so this is taking a look at it from the nation perspective, a federal perspective. So there is $42.5 roughly billion for the BEAD program that's called the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program. And primarily that will focus on improving infrastructure to unserved areas of the state and nation. There's also $2.75 billion for the Digital Equity Act, focusing on things I spoke about earlier, emphasizing digital equity and inclusion, things like device access and literacy and affordability. So that's a really key component as well that is a part of this act. There's tribal dollars coming, $2 billion for that, and $1 billion for middle mile that will be coming as well. Kind of along the side of that slide, you'll see that there's $14 billion for the FCC, which is for the Affordable Connectivity Program that I spoke about earlier. That really addresses the issue of affordability, and that's that $30 monthly discount for eligible households. So that's a really critical component of this. Again, that kind of gets at that issue of affordability. In total, that's about, well, without the FCC money, in total, that's about $48 billion that the NTIA will administer. That's the National Telecommunications and Information Administration. Then there's some other dollars in there, $2 billion for the USDA and more. But in total, that's about $65 billion for broadband that's coming towards the nation and towards our state. It is difficult to say right now specifically when funding and how much funding will be coming to Wisconsin, but we're definitely encouraged, and I would say stay tuned. There was actually a major kind of milestone event this morning. The NTIA, who is administering a lot of this funding, they released their NOFOs, or Notice of Funding Opportunities, which kind of sets forth the framework and guidelines by which these programs will operate. So there was a significant milestone this morning. I had some emails in my inbox at 6 a.m., but it's pretty exciting to see. That was a very important milestone to get us towards leveraging these dollars to connect residents, households, businesses, locations across the nation and the state in particular. So I would say stay tuned for more funding information on the Infrastructure Act. But with that, I would just like to say thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak, Wisconsin Community Media and Mary in particular. So I don't know if we want to take questions now or if we want to do that later on, but I'd be happy to take them now if you'd like, if there are any. That was probably a lot, so hopefully your head's not spinning. Yes?
Thank you so much. Really excited to see what's going to be happening in Wisconsin with the state plan, too, that will be articulated as a part of that NOFO that you talked about in the next year. One of the questions I've got for you that is sort of pertinent to the work of a lot of the organizations here that they're thinking about and that they will be continuing to work on in coming years is Wisconsin is doing this type of investment, is access to civic information and useful local information, particularly where you have communities that are, and I know that John and Bob will be talking about this a little bit later in their presentation. Does the state think about that access to local information as a...
You cut out there a little bit.
Do you see that access to useful local information and civic information to be able to work with local government and to be a part of the local community fully as a digital equity issue? Absolutely.
I had that slide that talked about the impact of broadband, but one of those is participation in democracy, participation in public processes. So absolutely, there are a number of things that I'd probably register to vote online and things like that. So absolutely, that is a digital equity issue and probably more a broader issue beyond that. But absolutely, that is something that we're thinking about and we consider kind of squarely within the realm of digital equity and inclusion. So you're spot on with that.
Can you give an example of how you are working to improve the accuracy of the coverage maps, especially in the rural areas? I see this weekly from clients in a rural county where, from my perspective, I know that the map says that, oh, sure, they've got broadband and they're getting it from this terrestrial wireless company. And in reality, they're getting 1/4 of a megabit.
Sure.
Yeah, but the advertising, of course, says it's up to 25, so they tell you that the map says 25, right?
Yeah, so we get our data from a variety of sources. The FCC has long been collecting broadband data. They have something that's called the Form 477. So they historically and still currently, I guess they're working on improving it right as we speak, but they have collected that data on a census block basis, meaning that if one address or location within a census block is served at a certain speed or can be served at a certain speed, the entire census block then is considered covered at that speed, which in rural cases, as you mentioned, there might be big census blocks where there might be a farm in the corner and then another farm in the other corner, and say one has access, but there's a lot of distance between that, and that speed and infrastructure might not exist on the other side of the census block. So that is an issue we're aware of. I oftentimes tell folks we use our map as a starting frame of reference. We don't treat it as absolute fact. When we're receiving applications, we encourage folks to tell us their story. They've got testimonials, surveys, speed tests, a wide range of things that can help illustrate what they're experiencing on the ground. So that is something that we do definitely encourage. And also, we work with internet service providers. We have partnerships with them across the state. And as opposed to using the FCC data as it stands currently, we work with them to give us granular sub-census block level data that helps improve that accuracy across the state. But that is a very common critique or issue that we hear about, is the map is wrong. That's probably the number one thing that we hear. So very well familiar and well aware, but I appreciate the comment. Thank you.
Last week, my city administrator said he wants to find out if there's any help that we could get for a fiber project. And I think he's perhaps just talking about connecting more municipal buildings.
Mm-hmm.
But I also thought, and I haven't met with him yet, that he was actually talking fiber to the home.
Okay.
Are there municipalities who are working towards that in Wisconsin?
I'm not specific. I don't understand fully specifically what we're talking about. Well, we do have our grant program, and there are eligibility requirements that are set forth. So the area has to be underserved for our current state grant round. They have to be underserved, which I won't get into the weeds of that, but they would have to be considered underserved to be eligible for the grant, and they would have to be an eligible entity as well. So those are kind of the two eligibility components that would, if they wanted to apply for funding, we don't currently have any. As I mentioned, applications were due in May or March, so we don't have any currently available. There will be more coming possibly, so I would say stay tuned, but pay attention to the eligibility and scoring. Thank you. Thank you.
So the second half of our closing luncheon presentation is entitled Filling the Gap in Local News Coverage, a Proposal. We have two speakers who are going to be talking about this topic. John Nichols is the Associate Editor of the Madison Capital Times and the National Affairs Correspondent for The Nation. Bob McChesney is Professor Emeritus at the University of Champaign-Urbana. Together, John and Bob have written many books on the topic of society and the role of media in a democracy, including Our Media, Not Theirs, The Democratic Struggle Against Corporate Media, The Death and Life of American Journalism, Communications Revolution, Tragedy and Farce, and People Get Ready. Today, they are presenting their conclusions about the state of local commercial news gathering and what public policy changes are needed to reinvigorate an effective local press. Please welcome John Nichols.
Thanks, Mary. You made that sound very academic, and I promise you it won't be. We are in far too serious a crisis right now to make this dull, so we'll try and make it as interesting as possible. Everything's going to hell. Except what Jaron's doing, which I'm very hopeful about, and we're only 20 years behind on universal broadband, but it is in fact true that the work Jaron's doing and others is catching us up. I still recall, and I certainly think many of you may as well, when former Governor Scott Walker turned down the federal wireless broadband money because he thought it might require Wisconsin to make some kind of commitment or do something as well. Back in 2011, it was one of his many short-sighted moves. And I think it's important to understand that our state has been severely harmed over the years by a lack of commitment in this regard. So I'm really excited to be here with somebody who's taking it seriously and working on it hard. So when I say everything's going to hell, what do I mean? Well, our media system is literally falling apart. If you could imagine a car that you had not changed the oil on or filled the air in the tires on or checked the engine on for about 20, 30 years, and you're out for an urgent drive, that's where we're at right now. It doesn't work as well as the technology that's taking that up. And when I say it's not working, I want to emphasize what I'm talking about here. We have, if you consider a media system's core responsibility in a democracy to inform people, to give people the information they need to govern themselves, right? You would think that as our population grows, as our issues that we deal with become more complex, that we would have an expanding number of people doing journalism. It's the opposite. We have half as many people working in journalism today as we had in 2008. So take that figure in. We're at half as many today as in 2008. Now, I know that many of you work in an area that's different from newspapers, but let's just talk about newspapers for a second, because the newspaper is historically where you had the most people doing journalism in any community, be it the smallest town, the town I grew up in, Union Grove, Wisconsin, the towns where many of my relatives still live in places like Spring Green and Walworth and River Falls. You know, the newspaper is still, to this day, where you've still got the most people who actually go and do journalism. But since 2005, we have lost more than 2,200 local newspapers in the United States. So we have half as many journalists working. We've lost more than 2,000 of the local newspapers. It's just falling apart. And if you look at the situation with broadcast news, be it on what we now, I guess, would not call it broadcast, but we think of it as the traditional legacy TV and radio, they have collapsed even more seriously. They now do the lie of telling you that you need 7 or 8 minutes of weather on the evening news to know what the weather will be the next day. I can do it right now. Hot. There you go. Under a second. And yet they take 7 or 8 minutes to do that. They do another 7 or 8 minutes to do sports. Then they do 7 or 8 minutes. This is on a so-called half-hour broadcast. 7 or 8 minutes to do local crime reporting. At the end of the day, you are actually dumber than if you hadn't watched the news. And I don't say this to pick on people who work in broadcast, because they work very, very hard. But here's the challenge. They tell you that the limited, diminished amount of information that they're giving you is what really matters, what you need to know. Well, you don't need to know what the weather was in Billings, Montana. You don't need to know what, just whatever the dreck that they feed you on a regular basis. You don't need to know most of the news you can use that you are given. And yet they do it. Why? Because it's free, right? You don't need to have a lot of reporters to go out and tell you that it's hot outside or something like that. And so they're dumbing down the amount of journalism you get. The number of journalists working has reduced dramatically. Why? Why, when we have a growing population, when we have all these challenges, do we get less information than we got before? Well, the answer is very simple. The entire system on which our journalism, media, news media, was built has collapsed, because the whole concept was that you would set up a newspaper, you'd get a whole bunch of advertising, you'd set up a radio station, TV, whatever, you'd get a whole bunch of advertising, and that advertising would sustain you. Well, that advertising left as soon as it could. It never had any loyalty to journalism whatsoever. There were no advertisers who were saying, yeah, I'm selling cars, and I sure want to fund the consumer reporters that tell you that you might get in a crash, right? There was never that. That was never the case whatsoever. They never wanted to fund journalism, and the second they got a chance to leave, they did. And they went into your phone, right? And I understand that a good third of you right now are probably looking at your phone even as you pretend to look at me. But the fact of the matter is that your phone has become a part of you. It's become such a part of you, right? It's wherever you are, it feels, if you're bored, you open your phone. If you are, you literally text whatever all the time, constantly. Well, that's fine. That's your communications. That's what you're doing. What advertisers see your phone as is the single best tool ever created to get into you, right? To get to you directly. And they don't want to have a newspaper or a broadcaster or even a digital news site getting in your way. They want to come to you directly. And so if you tap on an ad, right, on a digital news site, right, on an online news site, the whole point is to get you to leave the news site and to never come back, right? Because they want to entertain you so much where you've gone and followed the ad. If you show an interest in something, they come and grab you, right? How many of you have looked at a pair of shoes online and then 2 days later you get an ad for that pair of shoes because you didn't buy it? And so they're coming back to get you. So advertising knows now that it doesn't need journalism. And it's never, ever coming back. And that's the important thing to emphasize. There is literally no way that the commercial model for supporting journalism and supporting news gathering and information gathering that might underpin democracy is ever going to be repaired or renewed. It is not going to happen. It's just like, literally, it's like a fantasy that they hold out because they don't want to admit the reality. And I say this as somebody who has worked in journalism for my entire adult life. I've worked for newspapers, I've edited newspapers, I've reported for newspapers, I've worked for magazines, I've edited magazines, reported for them, I've hosted TV shows, I've hosted radio shows, I've hosted podcasts, I'm on Twitter, I do all these things. The whole bit, I've done the whole thing. I am telling you as someone from the inside, there is no funding model that's going to support journalism sufficient for democracy in America. It isn't there, it's never going to be there again. And if you still say, well, Mr. Nichols, I just don't buy it, right? Well, consider this fact. For every 10 journalists who've been lost on newspapers and in legacy media, the online media has produced 1 journalist, right? So every 10 that's lost over here, you get 1 over here. There's this fantasy that somehow there's going to be some digital replacement. It isn't going to happen. And so we have to ask ourselves, well, do we care? Does this matter to us at all? Well, it does to me, because I didn't go into journalism for the fun of doing journalism, although I love doing it, and I'll do it as long as I possibly can. I went into journalism because I saw it as an integral part of sustaining a democracy, sustaining a free and functional civil society. And if you don't have sufficient communications, if you don't have journalism functioning, as we do not today, remember, it's already collapsed. It's just going to get worse. If you don't have that, your democracy goes into rapid decay. And I would submit to you that I'm not going to go into detail on this, but I would say our democracy is at a point of as much peril as I have ever seen in my lifetime. We literally have an open conflict over whether the last election was decided for the guy who won by 7 million votes, right? A guy who swept the Electoral College. That's an open issue which a huge portion of the population of the United States doesn't accept. I mean, if you need any other measure of the fact that our democratic system is in real trouble, I will give you this. We, compared to every other country that we would want to compare ourselves with in the world, have virtually no voter turnout. We have the lowest voter turnout compared to other developed countries around the world. France was deeply embarrassed because they recently had elections, and they had turnout well over 70%, almost 80%. And they were ashamed. They were saying, boy, they actually report on TV the abstention rate. They said, like a quarter of the people aren't voting. What the hell is wrong? How is our society is falling apart? Do you realize that if in a local election in the United States only a quarter of the people weren't voting, we would be popping champagne corks? It'd be like the biggest turnout we've ever seen. We are actually the reverse of the rest of the world. What they see as a crisis, we accept as our reality. And even in presidential campaigns, when you take out all the people that are disenfranchised and then just simply don't vote, our turnout in presidential campaigns is laughable. Virtually close to half of Americans in many presidential campaigns don't participate. That's at the top. And so our democratic system is in a terrible place. And you think, well, boy, maybe this was how it was always intended to be. Well, it's not. The fact of the matter is that as flawed as they were, the founders of the American experiment understood that you had to have a free press to sustain that experiment. That's why they put freedom of the press into the Bill of Rights. It's not there because they said, boy, we got to make sure that Rupert Murdoch, when he immigrates from Australia, will have free will to do whatever he wants. They weren't concerned about that. What they were concerned about was to have a great many local competing media outlets telling the stories of their places at the local level, not some big national CNN or something like that. The concept of a free press was to have a lot of journalists doing a lot of journalism to tell people what was going on. And they knew full well that it would not be sustained by the market. They knew that in the 1790s. That is why they set up a postal subsidy so that anybody who started a newspaper got 90% of the cost of distributing that newspaper free. It was off. 90% of the cost. The federal government did the postal subsidy at the start. Every newspaper that existed, every media outlet, and remember when I talk about newspapers, just, we moved to new outlets and new times, but this basic concept that every media outlet was sustained by the postal subsidy. In many states, they even gave them other subsidies and other benefits, always done not with the thought of controlling it by the government, right? It's that if you set up a newspaper, you got the postal subsidy. You didn't have to be powerful or rich or connected. And to give you an example of this, some of the first African-American businesses in the United States, some of the first black-owned businesses to get any kind of aid whatsoever from the government were those that got the postal subsidy. Abolitionist newspapers in the 1820s were getting the postal subsidy. Women who started publications in the early 1800s got that postal subsidy. It is how we opened up our discourse. When de Tocqueville came and toured the United States, wrote Democracy in America, he marveled at the number of publications, at the amount of people doing journalism. And he said, correctly, that this was how America became a democracy. And we look at our situation now, and we say where we have come. We gave it over to the market. We said the advertising would support it. The advertising has not supported it. It's falling apart. It's in collapse. It is a crisis where literally half our people don't vote or more, where huge numbers of our people don't believe the results of elections, where fake news is often more powerful than the real news that people should be getting. It's a crisis. And you ask yourself, well, what are we going to do about it? Well, Bob McChesney and I have been working for the better part of 20 years on media issues. We study it from a whole host of different directions. And we believe that the answer to our problem is not to, root around trying to think up some kind of new solution. It's actually to return to the genius of the founding of the American experiment. As flawed as it was, the one thing they surely got right, which was that we, the people, should be supporting and sustaining a free press that will underpin and strengthen our democracy. And so let me introduce Bob McChesney to tell you a little more about that. Thanks for listening to me.
Thank you. Yeah, well, thank you, John. That was a great setup. Just to put a punctuation or an exclamation point on what John was saying, and I know a lot of you are from rural parts of Wisconsin, but you don't have to be from a rural part to experience what we're talking about. This country used to be flooded with journalists until really a couple generations ago. Some of the people my age still remember glimmers of what that was like. Your grandparents, if you're my age, were swimming in journalism. And all through the country's history we had it. It was the thing that defined this country. And it used to be that even in the smallest town, you actually would have newspapers with reporters who cover it. And it would connect people. It's more than just keeping an eye on people in power. It's giving people a sense of community. Who else lives there, what's going on, what people are doing, drawing people together to see common ground that they have. And we've lost that now. We've pretty much lost that. And I want to underscore something John just said. We're not talking about getting newsprint and ink and paper back. That's really not ever coming back in any significant way. It's about the human labor that goes into creating something in a community that's shared in that community. And that's going to be primarily digital going forward. But it's the content and the human labor that does that, and the people who are accountable for that is what we've lost and what we have to get back, and that's what's so imperative. Now, finally, after 100 years of basically thinking the market, as long as we give billionaires a chance to make money or wealthy firms, they can do our journalism for us, the billionaire class, the Wall Street has abandoned journalism. You know who buys up all the newspapers now, including in this state? Hedge funds. Vulture capitalists. They strip it for parts then. They know the industry's dead. No one's investing in newspapers who say, hey, journalism's got a future. We go online, we can make a lot of money doing journalism in the community. It's all the hedge funds who are buying it up, stripping it for parts, selling the real estate until it dies, then they're going to jump ship. They have no interest in journalism. And it's all about to disappear. And the local level now in America and most neighborhoods in America are something that have never existed until very recently. It's called a news desert. And that refers to an area where there's actually no newsroom covering that community, no paid reporters. And if you expand it to a really more honest definition, competing newsrooms in the community. So you're not living with Pravda and Izvestia, but you've got at least two different institutions covering it, so they're competing with each other. Most of this country is now what's called a news desert. There's just simply not coverage going on, completely inadequate and insufficient. Now, the good news is that Congress has finally sort of come to understand the extent of this crisis and how the dreadful implications of it. But there's still, it's slow moving. The legislation that's come about so far that's been considered, none of it's been passed yet, has been basically about patching up the commercial system, trying to somehow keep the dream alive that we'll have entrepreneurs come along who are going to start all these newspapers if we just give them a little help, pay some of their wages for their employees, tax credits. None of it's passed and it won't work. At best, if you somehow got these things to pass, you might get the level of employment back to what it was 5 years ago. Remember the glory days of 2017, how great the journalism was then? Exactly. Now, if we're serious about journalism, we've got to go back a generation or two, and that's the branch of American history you start at. You go back to the mid-20th century. You go back really the entire 19th century. And we've got to come up with a federal program that has the same vision the program John described with the postal subsidies. We basically distributed all newspapers virtually for free for 100 years to encourage newspapers to exist, to lower the costs to people to start them. In the program I've been working on with John, and it's still in fruition, and I'm going to give you just broad outlines. It invites lots of really smart questions I'm not going to be able to answer, and I don't think we'll even the Q&A. So if you post the piece on the website, you can read a 20-page piece that answers most of the questions people have initially. But I'll give you some of the ideas we have, what we're working on. First of all, we think journalism is important. We take this from Thomas Jefferson. We think it is important to national security and the defense of the republic as having nuclear weapons and having a navy and having an army. Jefferson was adamant about this. Having an informed citizenry is the most important line of defense for a society. If you don't have that, everything else is meaningless. You'll have tyranny. So in that case, then, what's the dollar sign you put on that? What's the dollar sign you put? When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, did we have a national discussion whether we could afford to fight the Japanese and the Nazis? Was there, well, can we afford that? Maybe we should just throw in the towel. Well, when you're talking about journalism, that's the sort of way you approach it. It's like, it's not whether you can afford it, it's how do you get the most bang for your buck and do it right. You don't have a choice. And that's where we are with journalism. We don't have a choice. So our basic idea is that what we need to do is have federal money, have a federal program set up and distribute the money to each county in the country on a per capita basis. So the amount of money you get is determined by how many people live in your county. And then there should be elections every 3 years, and people in that county will vote to distribute that money to all the qualified nonprofit groups that apply to participate and become journalism entities. And so the people who get the most money are the ones who have the most support in the community. And there are elections, so if you don't like the existing people who get the money the first time out, you can replace them the next time out. And they can't take money from any other source. They can't be connected to any other group. It's just all they do is get this money and they produce journalism for their community, and that's what you judge them on. They can't be owned by the Koch brothers. They're nonprofit. They can't pay big salaries. They're nonprofit. They do journalism, period. They don't get money from foundations, from billionaires. They don't sell advertising. They're not competing with any commercial enterprise. They just do journalism. That's the whole idea. And it's competitive. And we think the core principles is you need competition, multiple newsrooms. So in an election, no one gets more than 25% of the money. So you at bare minimum have 4 quality newsrooms in every area. Now in really rural areas, you have to smirch a lot of these counties together to get a population base significant enough. But in most places, that's not going to be an issue. So you've got to have competition. They've got to be nonprofit and non-commercial. They have to be fully independent. what you see is what you get. You can't be part of secretly of some network or organization. Locally based. People have to live there, the content produced there, not somewhere else. It's not a front for anything. Lots of fraud protection. Also, and most importantly, it has to be completely uncensored. The genius of the postal subsidy was and is that they don't censor for content. In fact, the few times they did censor for content, like with abolitionist papers in the South, it was considered a national scandal. You've got to basically, whoever gets elected, that's the people's choice. You live with it. You have to trust democracy and let the marketplace of ideas compete. That's the way it works. And just have to trust that people can manage their own lives. If not, then the whole idea of democracy is a joke. So you have to believe in it. Now, when you have one other sort of side effects, we're not trying just to get back to 30 years ago or 50 years ago. We're trying to get ahead of any time. We're trying to get a real democracy going. One of the great problems of our journalism, even at its best, was that ethnic minorities have been ignored. Poor people, basically, have been ignored, but ethnic minorities in particular, immigrant groups, actually they used to have their own press system, but certainly by the 20th century, they were increasingly ignored. Under this system we propose, there will be a room for all sorts of people to have voices, their own journalists in their communities, all across the country. In a competitive market. There won't just be like one model of journalism that has to fit everyone. You'll have 4 or 5, 6 in a large city or county like county Chicago or Milwaukee. You're probably going to have 10 or 12 recipients producing content. It's going to be pretty exciting. And the other point I would say, and I'll wrap up soon on this, the other point I'll say is that we've thought of journalism in America in the commercial era as being just the facts, ma'am. Just tell us what's going on. You report, we decide. And in that evolved for a very clear reason. That evolved because our newspaper system in every city is becoming, our news media system is increasingly becoming monopolistic. And if all the media are just trying to tell you the same thing, you don't need more than one media to tell you the same thing. We need to get back to the 19th century, the first 100 years, when our voter turnout rate oftentimes was vastly higher than it's been in the last 50 years. And understand that newspapers are actually political institutions. That's what the framers thought of. That's why the post office subsidy was given. The newspaper is what organizes popular opinion and gets people engaged with politics. We want a diversity of viewpoints. We want that to happen. We want them to draw people into public life. There isn't just one way to look at the war in Ukraine. There's probably 4 or 5 ways. We want to have access to all those ways so we can make an opinion where we don't feel like we're being railroaded. But we've got enough information from trustworthy sources. That's why you need to have this diversity, and that's why we need to think of a press system that really invigorates our whole democratic system, because it brings people into public life. And this is the sort of press system we think will be able to do something like that. I'd like to tell you that they'll vote on it next week in Congress, and it's likely to pass. But I won't pull your leg. We've got a ways to go before we get to that point, a lot of work to do. And it will cost a lot of money. What I've been describing, if we did it and it worked, would probably cost in the area of $35 or $40 billion a year. And that would give us an extraordinary system with hundreds of thousands of reporters in this country. I mean, 10 times what we have today working there. I'd like to say that's possible and that's going to happen and we can do that. But the amount of money for that is $35 billion. Now you're saying $35 billion. That used to be, before this presentation and before the recent wars and look at our budgets, a lot of money. But $35 billion, that's like one weapon system. $35 billion is half of what the broadband expansion plans are that you were describing. It's less than we're giving Ukraine. I mean, $35 billion to keep the republic alive and have the greatest press system in the history, that's pretty good. And why is it so cheap? If I can answer that question. It's because with the new digital technologies, getting rid of having advertising sales, not having to have trucks distribute your paper, not having to have fancy, expensive plants to produce your paper, your costs for everything but labor really shrink dramatically. So instead of having labor be 20% of the revenues of news media, they're going to be more like 80%. So you get a lot more bang for your buck with the money because there's all going to pretty much go into content production. That's where the whole heart and soul of it is. So we can get that for a lot less money than would have been possible in a pre-digital for-profit era. I think that we have a chance to do this. We have to do it. I will say that John and I have been and a few other people have been talking to people around the country in talks like this for the last 6 months or so. And the response has been overwhelmingly enthusiastic for people who say, yeah, we need to have some sort of system of journalism that's going to work effectively and allow this country to survive. And I hope you'll all take an interest in Mary. Hopefully you can post it and you can look at it. Stay in touch. Eventually it will become a political issue. There will be a political campaign for it. And when you do hear about it, please do everything you can to support it. And the last thing, most important, is that among the first groups that will be eligible to participate in this will be a number of journalists who started local nonprofit groups like we have here in Wisconsin. They would be the naturals to come in and compete for these funds in elections. NPR stations, community stations, PBS stations, if they set up and follow the same guidelines as everyone else, could have divisions doing nothing but journalism with this money. So we've got institutions ready and waiting. In Wisconsin community media, there's absolutely no reason in your community you couldn't host the resources to organize something to do like that if this system came into place. I mean, it's there for people to make of it what they want. But if you want to grift, you want to hustle, you want to scam, stay away. But if you want to do journalism, come on aboard, we need you. Thank you very much.
Any questions for John and Bob?
Sure. We got somebody.
I'm a real loud mouth, so don't worry. No, we're waiting for the camera. Can you hear me? Oh, hi, camera. Oh, okay, I have to talk to the mic. Okay. I see here that you are a co-founder of the Free Press. Is that something I should look into in order to stay in touch with your initiative here?
Yes. Free Press is a group that Bob and I started with some other folks about almost 20 years ago. It's a very long time ago. We wrote a book called It's the Media Stupid, making some base arguments on the importance of media being an issue. And of all things, Bill Moyers put us on for a couple of shows. And we got an awful lot of people that were interested. And we started Free Press as an organization, some of you may even have been involved, of content creators, journalists, consumers of media, artists, others, to say, look, we need a system that is much more supportive of a democracy-sustaining media. You can find Free Press online, and freepress.net, as Bob very wisely says, and it's a group that's very, very involved in a lot of the core issues right now. Also, some of the stuff that Bob and I have written about this has been posted at Columbia Journalism Review and other media analyst groupings that have taken a look at some of this stuff.
And also, Free Press is very active in all the internet and broadband stuff that Jaron was talking about. So.
Another question.
When you talk about, you said it's dead, it's not coming back, and you're looking to go forward. Is that looking at all the mediums? Or are you saying, look, that those traditional mediums are dying off, we need to look more towards digital, or is all of this still going TV, newspaper?
Well, specifically journalism, because journalism is uniquely dependent on advertising. The commercial journalism model, basically a newspaper had 80% of its revenue from one form of advertising or another. No popular journalism to the general public could be supported just by subscriber fees. There simply aren't, it's that the costs don't work out. That's why the government had to have the postal subsidy to basically take away the entire distribution cost to newspapers to make it feasible. So other media are affected too. Music industry's been turned upside down because of digital, but they found a way now to sort of make it work and land on its feet. Same thing with entertainment industry. But journalism's the one that's just wiped off the map. You go home and you turn on your TV and there's lots of entertainment options. Turn on your TV, there's not much original journalism. In fact, there's almost none. What you think of as journalism, you think, oh, I watched MSNBC last night, I'm really down on it. Basically, MSNBC, John's been on it, they don't even have any reporters to speak of. They basically all look, they have blowhards on Fox. Fox, MSNBC, CNN, they basically talk about one reporter at the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times actually did something. There are very few actual newsrooms in this country that cover, that's national politics, and even less that cover local politics. So that's one industry that is absolutely, its model is totally gone. The commercial entertainment industry, they're transitioning, they're changing, but they're not going to go away. Now, a crucial factor for the commercial entertainment industry is what's called copyright. If you produce content, you get to you own it. If someone wants to use it, they've got to pay you. Journalism doesn't really benefit by copyright. It's not the sort of thing where, hey, if you want to look at my article I wrote 9 years ago in this town paper, you have to pay me. Someone says, well, screw you, I don't want to look at it that badly. It's just not an option. And by the way, in our plan, the local journalism initiative, everything produced with the public money instantly goes in the public domain. Everyone gets it for free. They can't charge you for it. You've paid up front with the taxes. Now it's available to everyone for free, uncensored.
So let me take, you want to follow up on that?
Well, I was just going to say, when you're looking at your plan forward with the subsidies, would you be giving, hypothetically at this point, subsidies to anyone, TV, radio, newspapers, all across the board?
Yeah, I mean, it wouldn't. Look, the bottom line is, if you're a nonprofit and you figured out a way to do journalism in your community, where are you at? Where are you from?
Monona.
All right, Monona, man, it rocks. So, and Monona actually has its own local radio station, among other things that are doing great. And so here's the deal. Your radio station, if I'm right, doesn't do a lot of news. Right? But let's say you're on the ground there in Monona. You've got a following. People like you. In fact, people even sometimes on the east side of Madison can catch it, right? Let's say that under this system, you say, you know what? We're trusted here. We've got people that like us. I think we can do some news. We're going to hire some young people that want to cover this community, maybe Cottage Grove, east side of Madison. We're going to kind of expand out and we're going to compete for some of that money. We think we can do it. Yes, that's exactly what we're talking about. And in a place like Dane County, I would not be surprised if there were half dozen, even a dozen outlets or institutions, maybe even a print one still. Somebody might pull that off. Maybe a broadcast, you know what I mean, or radio. But yeah, digital would be the key. And chances are that if you did it in Monona, you would do a digital component. You'd do an online, like written out kind of component as well. But the bottom line is that under this system, what we're talking about, if people are ready to do journalism where they live and to employ probably young people to go do it, there'll be resources to do it. And that's the critical thing. I know that we've got people from Hayward, folks like that. Look, I've been up in Hayward, and it's getting to look a little news deserty up there in northern Wisconsin. And imagine if we could get genuine amounts of resources in so that a local community media outlet could perhaps take a space, maybe even within the underutilized post office building, right? And actually start to develop a newsroom. And suddenly you're covering Northwest Wisconsin in a real way, and other places across the country. Once you start to think about this is something really exciting. And it's also something really possible. And remember, I say this as somebody who has never worked anywhere but commercial media. I've always been, in newspapers and TV, the whole bit, doing MSNBC, all these things. And so I wish that it was perhaps easier, right? I wish there was a simple way to do this. I'm telling you, as somebody from the inside, there's not a simpler way to do this. You can't do it without getting the resources for journalism to the people that need it. And that's why when we were offered a chance by Mary to come speak, we jumped at it because you are exactly the people we're talking about. You're exactly what we want because you're already there doing it. And imagine if you had the resources, where are you at? Where's your media? Yeah.
I'm from South Holland, Illinois.
There you go. South Holland, Illinois. Population?
26,500.
And imagine if you could set up a newsroom there, right? With, maybe 5 or 6 young people working for you, covering that community and neighboring communities. Where are you? Yeah, where are you from? Oshkosh. Now, Oshkosh got a little bit of media there already. Still got the Northwestern, and it's getting thinner and thinner by the day.
Well, we're somewhat like Sheboygan too, where we're kind of in the middle of the Green Bay and Milwaukee DMAs or markets. So the TV coverage, unless someone gets shot or something crazy happens, they're not coming down to do stories on us. So I understand what you're saying about the news desert.
Even when you say that in Oshkosh, which is a town that actually has, at least some legacy media there, local radio stations, stuff like that. But imagine if in Oshkosh you could have 25 people covering Winnebago County, right, and some of the surrounding areas. That's not an unreasonable number. And you know what's the interesting thing about it? That's what the Northwestern used to have, right?
Right.
And so we're not talking about doing something radical here. We are simply talking about doing something that brings us back to a level of coverage where our communities are actually covered, where we actually pay attention to it. And what's the payoff for that? The payoff for that is that we stop getting all of our news and all of our information from somebody sitting in Washington or New York who's arguing on Fox or MSNBC or someplace, and we start getting stuff from where we live. And when we get information from where we live, it becomes a lot easier to believe that the election wasn't stolen, or that it really does matter to participate, or that our school board really is consequential, that it matters, right? That's what we're talking about, is kind of breaking what we think of as a pattern now, where our dialogue and our discourse is being set at 30,000 feet, and people down on the ground aren't really having a chance to have a perspective on it and engage with it where they live. So we think the world gets saved via South Holland and Oshkosh, and maybe even Monona. But we don't think it happens unless the resources are made available to those places.
I have a question about journalism, because you talk a lot about saving journalism, and then in the early days, there were these penny presses that were very partisan, very advocacy-oriented. How are you dealing with like the difference between straight news, just the facts kind of thing, versus sort of a more editorializing viewpoint kind of journalism?
Well, we don't prescribe anything. We think this is a system, if it's going to work, it's what the people want to make of it. So the one thing that I didn't mention, we think that we shouldn't think in terms of like one news medium and that's the only one I'm going to use. This isn't Soviet Union. We don't have to have Pravda. We want to have competition. So what we plan and what we call for is everyone gets 3 votes for 3 different media, not just 1 vote. So you can pick an array of media you want. So maybe you'll pick one that say they try to do what's called straight news, professional news. That's good. And then there's another one, might be one that you like their angle, you want their take on things. So you get a choice. I think you have a mix, but I think that's something we can't determine for people. I think that's something people determine for themselves, the mix they want, they're comfortable with. And if they don't like it, they can get a new mix the next time out in 3 years. But I think, again, if it comes from someone else, it's not going to work. It's got to come from within. And if people make a mess of it, well, as Ben Franklin said, it's a Republican if you can keep it.
Let me give you one other quick bit on that, too. I come from Madison. And in Madison, we still have 2 newspapers, the Capital Times and the State Journal. And historically, those 2 newspapers have existed for more than 100 years in competition, and sometimes, via, bizarre agreement where they're printed in the same place. But the bottom line is everyone in Madison knew that the Cap Times was the progressive paper and the State Journal was the conservative paper. That was just, people knew that. Now, did that mean that they didn't cover the East High versus West High football game? No, they did. And amazingly enough, they generally covered it, straight up. Does it mean they didn't cover City Hall straight up? No, actually, they generally did. But they had an opinion, too. They had a perspective that came through. And the fact of the matter is, we have never, ever in America, ever had straight down the line, just the facts, ma'am. People always say, I want just the facts, right? Stuff like that. Well, Walter Cronkite in 1968 took his glasses off and said, I don't think this Vietnam thing is working on CBS News. And we all say, well, Walter Cronkite, that was the embodiment of this just the facts, ma'am, straight up report. It never existed. What we want is fair, honest coverage, some of which will have a perspective, but all of which is rooted in the places where we live. Because the fact of the matter is, if you become too rigidly ideological, if you become, too, obsessed with your own opinion and nothing else, the people around you aren't going to be interested in it anymore. They're going to want something more than that. They want to know what's going on at their school board, their city council, their county board, in their community. And so the fact of the matter is that what we're talking about is restoring a system, but also creating a system where people can get the information that they need, and they can get it from a lot of different perspectives. Milwaukee, 100 years ago, had 8 newspapers. It had, a morning conservative paper and an afternoon liberal paper, the Journal and the Sentinel. It had the Leader, which was the socialist newspaper. It had several Polish language and German language newspapers because those were ethnic communities within it. It had a newspaper oriented toward the black community. It had newspapers oriented toward other ethnic communities. There was a media system, and it functioned. And yes, they had different perspectives, but at the end of the day, they gave people a great deal of information about what was going on. And I think one final thing I'll say on this that's important to understand. It wasn't nirvana. It wasn't perfect. The press of 100 years ago or 50 years ago or 20 years ago failed on a regular basis. It wasn't everything that we wanted them to do. It didn't do enough investigative reporting. It didn't question power enough. We know that, right? But the fact of the matter is that it was out of that press that our understanding today of what we should have challenged and what we should, that notion of evolving and growing, a dialectic where things get better and better. Well, instead of having a press today that would be better than what we had, we've got nothing. We have a void. And that's the crisis. We don't want to go back to what we had 50 years ago or 100 years ago. We want to go forward to a better press system than we have ever had, one that is more sustaining and more supportive of democracy than anything we have ever seen, so that this country can actually solve its fundamental challenges and go to core issues rather than, kind of talk around it or simply argue with itself.
So are you envisioning a local media center like ours to develop at some point a writing staff of journalists that might be the cross between the Center for Investigative Journalism and Wisconsin Eye and what we are now, which is community media supporting the local meetings and broadcasting those for providing that for our community?
I don't think there's a preordained vision of how any community center, a media center should approach this, but I would say if you're in a community where there's not much journalism and this program comes along, and let's say there's some former journalists or some young journalists or some people who want to do journalism who are trying to coalesce and develop, they might come to you or to the center and say, hey, we'd like to work on this. And then you could say, yeah, let's put it together and go in on this together. That's the sort of thing. The content, the nature of it, to be determined by the people involved, not by anyone else.
Any other questions?
I was kind of interested in your thought of news deserts, because right now in a lot of our areas, we are the only source for information for our residents. I guess, how do you see our community media centers acting in that role in the void of journalism, especially progressing in the next 5-10 years or so?
In the void that exists. Where are you at?
West Bend.
West Bend. And West Bend's probably a classic example of what we're talking about. A place that historically has had a real sense of itself, right? Mm-hmm. And historically had media that was of that place, right? Somebody might spend a whole lifetime working on the local paper or on the local radio station, but now you end up with the paper much smaller perhaps, or even owned by somebody that doesn't live there. I think of Racine, near where I grew up, and it's just, the change has been radical. It's hard to even describe how different things are than what they were. And so yes, in a place, the media centers that you folks operate now are absolutely vital. This is a part of the communications infrastructure that we have today. What we are suggesting is, just think if we could supercharge it, right? Just think if you could restore a situation where West Bend really did have a sense of, this is a place, and we're going to talk about the issues and the character of this place in really in-depth ways. And we're going to do investigative work too. We're going to cover the meetings. We're going to cover what's going on. But we'll look at some things in some deeper ways. And we'll look at the challenges facing this community and the opportunities facing it as well. You know, the fact of the matter is that this is why I love talking to this group of people, because you know better than I what might work in your community. And I've got enough faith in you that you took, you know, a nice May afternoon to come to the, you know, down to Madison or come sit in the overly air-conditioned room and you know, listen to Jaron talk about broadband and us ramble about this stuff. You know, you care enough to be engaged, right? You are already. And it's just a question of, if we could give you the resources to do a whole lot more, what would you do? And in some cases, what you would do would be, it'd be a noble experiment that failed, right? You try something and it just didn't work. The genius of the plan we're talking about is there's every 3 years, right? The different media centers and media outlets, they compete for their share of the funding, right? If you're doing a lousy job, you're not going to get it. On the other hand, if you're doing a great job and you're really making some things happen, you might get a lot more and be able to hire that next, you know, 5 or 6 or 8 or 10 people to go cover your community. This is, and I know, one final thing I want to say here. I know it feels like when I talk about, you know, having 10 journalists coming in to cover West Bend, like 10 more journalists to do that, that sounds like, whoa, that's a lot. It isn't a lot. It's what we used to have. It's literally what used to happen. Newspapers, and we only reference newspapers not because that's the supreme, you know, all good things. It's just that that's what the newsroom was. Now it will be a digital or maybe a broadcast newsroom, however it works. But the fact is,
It'll all be digital.
It'll all be digital, as Bob says. But the bottom line is how whatever platform you're using, whatever, that's for you to decide how to make it work. But what I'm telling you is having a dozen people covering West Bend, that's not crazy. That's what you should have. And having, you know, dozen people covering Monona, that's not crazy. You know, we have convinced ourselves that we can get by with so little journalism, with so little information, and so poorly presented that, you know, that's just the way it is. It shouldn't be that way. We should have a rich, vibrant array of journalism presented in all sorts of incredibly creative ways so that people engage at a level higher than they have ever engaged before, and that they feel like media is something connected to them, not something that just talks to them.
Okay, another question. We're going to be here all afternoon in air conditioning.
Yeah.
Do you have a vision of how, what are the steps, or how do you see us getting the federal funding? And if you got $15 billion as a one-time pilot program, how do you sustain it and keep it as an ongoing appropriation year after year?
Great questions. The political vision that's guided this it initially started, I think we went in earnest in 2019. We really, because then the collapse of local journalism was so severe that no one ever said, no, you got it all wrong. It's really great where I live. You never heard that.
You should point out, just quickly, that we used to go out and people would challenge us.
Yeah.
But they don't anymore.
Yeah. So it became clear that across the board, it wasn't a political issue. It wasn't like liberals said there was no journalism, conservatives loved it. Whatever one's political views, if they had no politics whatsoever, they got it. There was no journalism in their community. They had no idea what was going on. You know, a lot of you are my generation or close to it. Talk to your children, find out what they know about their community. It's scary. I mean, stuff that we took for granted that you would know about your community because you just glanced at a front page. Kids today, if it's not on TikTok or whatever that is, it might not be happening to them. Well, that's because there's not a journalism there that they can embrace. So the political message in 2019 was, how do we get Congress to take this seriously and pass it? And our initial hope, and it failed, was that if there was a new administration that came into power after the 2020 election, that would have to go through with a huge infrastructure package, that they could include journalism in that as part of the necessary infrastructure of the country. And the amount of money we're talking about would be a drop in the bucket for the sort of trillions of dollars they were talking about. That was our hope. We couldn't get our act together close enough. The political winds did not go far enough to make that possible. So we went back to the drawing boards. And of course, the problem we face is that in the near term, there's so many survival issues that are being covered by Congress that they have to deal with. Squeezing something new on the agenda, you've got to really have your act together. You don't just toss something up there and say, figure it out. So we're in that getting our act together phase. Just recently, some people in Washington have talked about starting a commission, which would get, like when public broadcasting was created in the United States, the Carnegie Foundation started a commission of all sorts of people, drew them together. What would you like if we had public broadcasting? And it led to the formation of PBS and NPR. And there's something like that that's in the wind now that might happen. I will say this. There are a lot of politicians who understand that this is a problem, because it used to be, and John knows this far better than I do, that if a politician was running for Senate in 1992, Russ Feingold, he's got a dozen reporters traveling with him from stop to stop. By 2010, Ralph's on his own. There's just no reporters. It used to be there's a whole plane of journalists who'd fly the presidential campaign with the candidate. Now that flight's empty. There just aren't that many reporters left. And so politicians know this. Tammy Baldwin comes back to Wisconsin and wants to talk about an issue. She's got to call John and maybe one or two other people to even have an audience. It used to be you could come back and talk to reporters all over the state to talk about the issues you're working on, and the information would get spread. So the politicians know this. And so they're not unsympathetic. We've just got to get a plan for them they can work on. That's what we're doing. Now, I do want to say, though, that there's a negative side to this, too. While I think everyone who wants it benefits by this plan and by having journalism, there are some elements of our society that are really happy with a journalism-free environment. There are some people in our society who really enjoy the fact that most people are prone to conspiracy theories, don't really know that much, and they are very powerful. And I'll be quite blunt, it's the people who supported Trump. It's the Mercers, it's the Kochs. These guys, they're explicit about it. They like no journalism. It gives them more power over what people think because there's no journalism getting in the way. So, and they have opposed us. They will be our opponents. That doesn't mean conservatives. That's a different thing. Conservatives will support it, but the specific people who just want power by any means necessary and benefit in having an ignorant population, they don't like what we're talking about. They hate it. And there are elements of our society, and it's not new, they've been there throughout our history, who oppose democracy. And this is all about democracy.
Let me give you one quick other element here. As regards, let's say you're in Sheboygan? Correct. Okay. Sheboygan is a cool town. And what's that?
Malibu of the Midwest?
It is the Malibu of the Midwest with a fine indoor theme park. Let's say Sheboygan, you're in Sheboygan County. You got a good sized population there. Remember, this would be done on the county level, right? And so to qualify to be, a candidate, your media outlet to be a candidate for this, you'd have to meet basic standards, right? You're going to follow the libel law. You're non-for-profit. You're going to make what you do journalistically available. You're going to accept certain standards as regards. You're not going to just, get $400,000 and pay yourself a $400,000 salary, right? There'll be some basic standards, which any of you could meet. And then once you've met those basic standards, none of which are ideological, none of which are partisan or anything like that, you would submit, right? And you're on that list, right? And the truth of the matter is you're probably going to do pretty well because a lot of people know your name. They know your Sheboygan Media Center, whatever you're calling yourself. But that's how it would work. And maybe 20% of people say, yeah, I would direct my resources that direction. It's a little bit like any kind of election, except it's not with candidates. It's with people giving. It's basically democratizing the process so that people in an area can move money in a particular direction. So you get that 20%. Maybe in your county, I don't know what the proportions will be, but let's say that comes to $1 million. You're sitting on $1 million for 3 years, and you figure out how to do great journalism with that. That's basically the standard. If you do fraud, we're gonna come and bang you, brother. You're gonna, you're gonna be in trouble with us. Somebody's gonna come and find you and get that money back. But if you're a straight shooter and you do some good journalism, what?
Shitty journalism.
Well, you could do some okay journalism. Sheboygan would never be bad, though.
No,
but Sheboygan's always.
There won't be a qualitative assessment.
It won't be. Nobody's going to say, "Oh, you're journalist." The people who live there are going to say it's good or bad. But the bottom line is, if you do a great job, there's a good chance you're going to get more the next time. And so you actually start, this becomes a sustainable thing. And our argument is that once people start to get good journalism where they live, that's connected to who they are and where they are, they're going to like it. And so I see a future for this program once you get there. Once you start it, I don't see it ending. But it's getting across that line, and it is like so many things in our society today, right? I think a lot of us have a pretty good idea of how we could do a fair and decent healthcare system, but getting it there is tough. A lot of us have some pretty good ideas about how we might save the planet and deal with climate change, but getting there is tough. And so I'm not telling you this is easy, but I am telling you that this is something that if you want to have a functional democracy, you've got to start to think about more. And if you come and say, you know, Mr. Nichols, I really like that McChesney guy. He's a good-looking fella, and I really trust him. But the plan you got is garbage. I don't like what you've come up with. I've come up with a better plan. If your plan, if you convince us, we're with you, right? Our bottom line is we simply want to save journalism as a functional reality in this country, and our suggestion is that this is one way to do it.
All right. Thank you, Bob, John. This is wonderful as always. Appreciate you coming. And that concludes the presentation part of the Wisconsin Community Media Conference. Those of you who are here in person, we do have something for you after this, so stay in your seats. I think Deb is, where did Deb go?